Sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the most devastating losses. When 67-year-old Margaret Maggie Thompson received the telegram that would shatter her world, she had no idea it would also lead her on a 200-mile trek through the Colorado wilderness that would test every ounce of strength she had left. What started as a desperate flight from tragedy would become a story of resilience that an entire mountain community would never forget. The year was 1952, and Maggie had been living quietly in her small farmhouse outside Denver, tending her vegetable garden and quilting by lamplight, when fate delivered 5 orphaned grandchildren to her doorstep. Their parents, her son Robert and daughter-in-law Helen, had perished in a factory fire that claimed 17 lives, leaving behind Emma, 12, twins Samuel and Sarah, 10, little Benjamin, 6, and baby Rose, barely 18 months old. But this isn't just a story about loss. It's about what happens when an elderly woman discovers strength she never knew she possessed, when 5 traumatized children learn to trust again, and when a struggling mountain town finds its heart through the most unlikely visitors. What Maggie couldn't have known as she loaded her meager possessions into a worn canvas bag was that their desperate journey would expose corruption, reveal hidden kindness, and ultimately transform not just their own lives, but an entire community. Nestled high in the Rocky Mountains, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maggie Thompson's weathered kitchen table as she read the telegram for the 5th time, her calloused hands trembling slightly with each word. The Western Union message had arrived 3 days ago, but the reality of its contents still felt impossible to grasp. Robert and Helen Thompson, along with 14 other workers, had been trapped in the Burlington textile mill when a boiler explosion triggered a fire that consumed the building within minutes. There had been no survivors. Maggie set the yellow paper down carefully, as if handling it too roughly might somehow make the news more real than it already was. At 67, she had buried her husband, watched friends pass one by one, and weathered enough hardships to know that life rarely offered second chances. But nothing had prepared her for becoming the sole guardian of 5 children ranging from a toddler to a girl on the verge of adolescence. The sound of small feet padding across the wooden floor drew her attention to the kitchen doorway, where 6-year-old Benjamin stood clutching a tattered stuffed bear that had seen better days. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles, and his brown eyes, so much like his father's, held a confusion that broke Maggie's heart anew each time she saw it. "Grandma Maggie," he whispered, his voice still thick with sleep, "when are Mama and Papa coming back?" This was the question that came every morning, and each time it felt like a fresh wound. Maggie had tried explaining about heaven, about how sometimes people couldn't come back, but Benjamin's 6-year-old mind seemed unable or unwilling to accept such a permanent separation. "Come here, sweetheart," she said softly, opening her arms to receive his small, warm body. "We talked about this, remember? Mama and Papa had to go to heaven, and they can't come back to visit us anymore." Benjamin's lower lip quivered as he pressed his face against her worn cotton dress. "But I miss them. I know, honey. I miss them too." Maggie stroked his hair, breathing in the scent of the lavender soap she'd used for his bath the night before. "But you know what? They sent you and your sisters and brother to stay with me because they knew I would take the very best care of you." The sound of baby Rose crying from the makeshift nursery Maggie had created in her sewing room interrupted their quiet moment. At 18 months, Rose was too young to understand what had happened, but she seemed to sense the upheaval around her, becoming fussier and more clingy with each passing day. "I'll get her," announced Emma, appearing in the kitchen doorway with the twins trailing behind her. At 12, Emma had appointed herself as Maggie's assistant, taking on responsibilities that seemed far too heavy for her young shoulders. Her auburn hair was already neatly braided, and she wore one of the 2 dresses Maggie had managed to salvage from the children's belongings. Emma had been the one to pack their few remaining possessions when Child Protective Services came calling. 2 days after the funeral, the social worker, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, had made it clear that Maggie's small farmhouse and limited income made her an unsuitable guardian for 5 children. Mrs. Thompson, the woman had said, consulting her clipboard with bureaucratic efficiency, "While we appreciate your willingness to take the children temporarily, you must understand that permanent placement requires adequate resources. A widow your age, living on a modest pension, simply cannot provide the stability these children need." Maggie had listened politely as Mrs. Patterson outlined the plans for separating the siblings among different foster families and institutions. Emma and the twins might be placed together with a family in Kansas City. Benjamin would go to a children's home in Topeka. Baby Rose, being the youngest and most adoptable, would likely be placed with a childless couple somewhere in the state. They belong together, Maggie had insisted, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. They've lost their parents. They shouldn't lose each other too. Mrs. Patterson's expression had softened marginally, but her resolve remained firm. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Thompson, but finding a family willing and able to take 5 children is simply unrealistic. These placements will ensure each child receives proper care and education." That conversation had taken place on a Wednesday. Mrs. Patterson was scheduled to return the following Monday to collect the children, which gave Maggie exactly 5 days to figure out what to do. The answer had come to her in the middle of the night as she sat rocking Baby Rose and listening to the wind rattle the farmhouse windows. Her younger sister Dorothy had written just months before about the life she'd built in Cedar Ridge, a small mining town high in the Colorado mountains. Dorothy's husband, Frank Morrison, had struck it moderately rich with a silver claim, and they'd opened a boarding house that catered to miners and their families. "You should come visit," Dorothy had written in her last letter. "The mountain air would do you good, and Frank always needs help with the books. There's talk of the railroad coming through in the next few years, which would bring more business. It's a good place for a fresh start." Maggie had filed the letter away, content with her quiet life in Kansas. But now, holding Baby Rose and watching over 4 other sleeping children, the idea of Colorado seemed less like a visit and more like salvation. The next morning, she'd walk to the general store and use the telephone to place a long-distance call to Cedar Ridge. The connection was scratchy and expensive, but Dorothy's voice came through clearly enough. 5 children? Dorothy had repeated, her surprise evident even through the static. "Maggie, that's wonderful that you want to keep them together, but are you certain you can manage such a journey? It's nearly 200 miles of difficult terrain." "I'm stronger than I look," Maggie had replied, though privately she wondered if that was true. "And these children need stability, not to be scattered to the winds like dandelion seeds." Dorothy had been quiet for a long moment before responding. "Frank and I would be happy to help however we can. Cedar Ridge could use more children anyway. The school's been struggling with low enrollment. But Maggie, you'd need to get here before winter sets in proper. The mountain passes become impassable once the heavy snows start." It was now late September, which meant Maggie had perhaps 6 weeks before winter weather would make travel impossible. 6 weeks to walk 200 miles with 5 children, including a toddler who couldn't make the journey on foot. The practical challenges seemed overwhelming. Maggie's savings amounted to less than $40, enough for supplies, but not nearly sufficient for train or bus fare for 6 people. Her old Ford pickup had finally given up the ghost last spring, and she couldn't afford to replace it. Walking seemed to be the only option, despite the obvious difficulties. That evening, after the children were settled for the night, Maggie spread her late husband's road atlas across the kitchen table and began plotting their route. The most direct path would take them northwest through Kansas into Colorado, then up into the mountains towards Cedar Ridge. The terrain would grow increasingly challenging as they climbed higher. But smaller mountain roads might offer shelter and the possibility of assistance from sympathetic travelers. She calculated they would need to cover roughly 7 miles per day to reach Cedar Ridge before winter, assuming they could walk 6 days. A week with 1 day for rest. 7 miles might not sound like much, but with children and whatever possessions they could carry, it would be a significant daily challenge. The sound of footsteps on the creaky floorboards interrupted her planning. Emma appeared in the kitchen, wearing her nightgown and carrying baby Rose, who had apparently woken hungry. She wouldn't settle, Emma explained, settling into a chair as Maggie prepared a bottle. "Grandma Maggie, I heard you talking to someone on the telephone yesterday. Are we going somewhere?" Maggie paused, measuring formula powder into a bottle. She had hoped to plan their departure more thoroughly before discussing it with the children, but Emma's perceptiveness made secrets difficult to maintain. "Would you like to take a trip to see your great-aunt Dorothy?" Maggie asked carefully. "She lives in a town in the mountains where there are lots of other children and a good school." Emma's eyes widened with interest rather than fear, which Maggie took as an encouraging sign. "How far away is it?" "Quite far," Maggie admitted. "It would be an adventure, but also hard work. We'd need to walk most of the way, carrying what we need with us." "Walk?" Emma repeated, testing the bottle's temperature against her wrist as she'd seen Maggie do countless times. "Like camping?" "Something like that." Maggie sat down across from her eldest granddaughter, studying the serious expression that seemed too mature for a 12-year-old face. "Emma, there are some things you need to understand. Some people think I'm too old to take care of you and your siblings properly. They want to send you to different families, split you up." Emma's face went pale. "They can't do that. We belong together." "I agree, which is why I think we should go to Colorado before they can make us separate. Your great-aunt Dorothy and Uncle Frank have offered to help us start over there." Emma was quiet for several minutes, gently feeding Rose while processing this information. Finally, she looked up at Maggie with determination that reminded her powerfully of Robert at the same age. "When do we leave?" "Soon," Maggie replied. "Before Mrs. Patterson comes back on Monday. What about our things?" Maggie glanced around the kitchen, taking in the familiar furniture, the photographs on the mantel, the quilt her mother had made hanging over the back of the sofa. Everything here represented her life with Harold, the 43 years they'd spent building something together in this little farmhouse. "We'll take what we can carry," she said simply. "The most important things. Everything else is just stuff." Emma nodded solemnly, as if accepting the weight of adult responsibilities that had been thrust upon her too early. "Should I tell the twins and Benjamin?" "Let me talk to them tomorrow," Maggie decided. "We'll have a family meeting and discuss our adventure together." As Emma carried baby Rose back to the nursery, Maggie returned to her atlas, making notes about water sources, small towns, and potential places to rest along their route. The magnitude of what she was planning began to settle over her like a heavy blanket. She was 67 years old, had never traveled more than 50 miles from home, and was preparing to walk across 2 states with 5 traumatized children. But what choice did she have? The alternative was watching her grandchildren disappear into a system that would erase their connection to each other and to her. Harold had always said that when life backed you into a corner, you had 2 choices: surrender or fight like hell to find another way out. Maggie Thompson had never been much of a fighter. But for these children, for the family they still could be, she was prepared to discover strength she'd never known she possessed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending autumn leaves skittering across the yard. Winter was coming, and with it, a deadline that left no room for second-guessing or lengthy preparation. In less than 4 days, she would load 5 children and whatever possessions they could carry into an old wagon she'd found in Harold's barn. and begin a journey that would test every limit she thought she had. The first step would be the hardest, walking away from everything she'd ever known and trusting that somewhere ahead, 200 miles through unknown territory, a new life was waiting for them all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, as if the sky itself was weeping for the departure about to unfold. Maggie had risen before dawn to pack the final items into Harold's old wooden cart, a sturdy contraption he'd built years ago for hauling feed and supplies around the farm. She'd reinforced it with rope and canvas, creating a makeshift shelter where baby Rose could ride protected from the elements. The family meeting the previous evening had gone better than expected. When Maggie explained their situation to all the children together, Benjamin had immediately volunteered to help push the cart, while 10-year-old Samuel had peppered her with questions about mountains and whether they'd see bears. His twin sister Sarah had been characteristically quiet, but nodded seriously when Maggie asked if she understood why they needed to leave. "We're like pioneers," Emma had declared, and somehow that framing had transformed their desperate flight into an adventure worthy of the storybooks the children loved. Now, as Maggie loaded their final supplies, blankets, clothing, dried foods, Harold's old camping gear, and the small metal box containing their important papers and her modest savings, she tried to channel Emma's optimism. They weren't refugees fleeing an impossible situation. They were pioneers seeking a new life in the Colorado mountains. The cart held everything they couldn't carry: Rose's makeshift crib, their warmest clothes, a week's worth of food, Harold's compass and hunting knife, Maggie's sewing kit, a few treasured books, and one special item each child had been allowed to bring. Emma had chosen her mother's jewelry box. The twins had selected a checkers set they could share. Benjamin clutched his stuffed bear, which didn't count toward his limit, and a wooden horse his father had carved for his 5th birthday. "Grandma Maggie," Sarah spoke up as Maggie secured the canvas cover over their belongings, "what if it rains the whole time?" "Then we'll get wet," Maggie replied matter-of-factly, "but we'll keep walking anyway." Rain never hurt anyone who was dressed properly for it. She'd spent her remaining money on sturdy shoes for each child and waterproof cloaks that would serve them well in mountain weather. Her own boots were the same ones she'd worn for farm work, practical, broken in, and built to last. Everything else would have to be enough. At precisely 7 o'clock, as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, Maggie gathered the children on the front porch for a final moment. The farmhouse looked smaller somehow, as if their decision to leave had already begun erasing it from their lives. "Are we ready?" she asked, studying each young face. Emma stood tall, holding baby Rose with practiced confidence. The twins flanked her, Samuel bouncing slightly with excitement while Sarah maintained her thoughtful composure. Benjamin gripped his bear with one hand and reached for Maggie's fingers with the other. "We're ready," Emma answered for them all. Maggie took a final look at the home she'd shared with Harold for over 4 decades, then firmly closed the door behind them. She'd left a note for Mrs. Patterson, explaining that the children were safe and cared for, but providing no details about their destination. Let the social worker wonder. The first mile was deceptively easy. The dirt road that led away from the farm was familiar territory, and the children chattered excitedly about their adventure. Samuel collected interesting rocks to examine later, while Sarah pointed out cloud formations that looked like animals. Even baby Rose seemed content, gurgling happily from her nest of blankets in the cart. But as morning progressed into afternoon, reality began to assert itself. Benjamin's initial enthusiasm waned as his short legs struggled to match the pace Maggie knew they needed to maintain. The cart, though well-built, was heavier than expected when fully loaded, requiring both Maggie and Emma to manage it over ruts and obstacles in the road. By their first planned rest stop, a grove of oak trees, Beside a small creek, Benjamin was dragging his feet and complaining that his legs hurt. Rose needed feeding and a diaper change, which meant unpacking supplies from the carefully organized cart. The twins, while still cooperative, had begun the low-level bickering that Maggie remembered from their previous visits. "This is harder than I thought it would be," Emma confided quietly as she helped Maggie prepare a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples. "Most worthwhile things are," Maggie replied, though privately she was already revising her estimates about their daily mileage. If they could manage 5 miles on this first day, she'd consider it a success. After lunch, she made an executive decision that would prove crucial to their journey's success. Instead of insisting everyone walk, she established a rotation system. Benjamin and Rose would ride in the cart together, with the older children taking turns as the primary cart pusher alongside Maggie. This arrangement immediately improved both their pace and morale. "It's like a parade," Benjamin declared from his perch atop their bundled belongings. "And I'm the king riding in my royal carriage." "If you're the king," Samuel called out, "then what does that make the rest of us?" "You're my royal knights," Benjamin decided solemnly, "protecting me from dragons and bandits." The game that evolved from this conversation carried them through the afternoon. Samuel and Sarah took turns being knights on quests, while Emma became the wise advisor who helped navigate obstacles. Even baby Rose participated by waving a small wooden rattle like a royal scepter. As evening approached, Maggie began watching for a suitable place to make camp. She'd identified several possibilities on her map, but the reality of traveling with children had already taught her that plans required flexibility. When they crested a small hill and spotted an abandoned barn in a field below, she decided it was worth investigating. The barn proved to be a godsend, weatherproof, spacious enough for their entire group, and far enough from any farmhouse to offer privacy. Better yet, a clear stream ran along the property's edge, providing fresh water for drinking and washing. "It's like a castle," Sarah declared as they explored the structure, which still smelled faintly of hay despite being empty. "A very drafty castle," Emma observed practically, but she was smiling as she said it. Setting up camp revealed another learning opportunity. Maggie had packed efficiently for space, but unpacking everything to reach their bedding and cooking supplies created chaos that took nearly an hour to organize. By the time she had baby Rose fed and settled for the night, the older children arranged in their blankets, and a small fire built safely outside the barn entrance, full darkness had fallen. "Tell us a story, Grandma Maggie," Benjamin requested, as they gathered around the fire for warmth and companionship. "What kind of story?" "A story about pioneers," Emma suggested. "About people who went on long journeys to find new homes." Maggie thought for a moment, then began weaving a tale about a family of pioneers who traveled across the prairie in a covered wagon, facing challenges that seemed to mirror their own journey: difficult weather, uncertain terrain, and the constant need to support each other through hardship. As she spoke, she watched the children's faces in the firelight, seeing how the story seemed to give shape and meaning to their own experience. When she finished, Sarah asked quietly, "Grandma Maggie, do you think our Mama and Papa would be proud of us for taking this trip?" The question caught Maggie off guard, striking directly at fears she'd been trying not to acknowledge. Was she doing the right thing, dragging these children across 2 states on foot? Was her determination to keep them together worth the risks and hardships they'd inevitably face? "I think they would be very proud," she said finally, her voice steady despite her doubts. "They would see how brave you're all being, how you're taking care of each other, and how you're willing to work hard for something important." "What's the most important thing?" Benjamin asked, his stuffed bear tucked securely under one arm. "That we stay together," Emma answered before Maggie could respond. "That's what families do." As the children settled into sleep, Maggie remained by the dying fire, consulting Harold's compass and her carefully marked map. They'd covered approximately 4 miles on their first day, less than her initial goal, but respectable given their learning curve. More importantly, the children had adapted to the journey's rhythm better than she'd dared hope. But challenges lay ahead that would test their resolve far more severely than a single day's walk. The weather was growing colder each night, and they still had nearly 200 miles of increasingly difficult terrain to navigate. Her $40 budget would need to stretch for food, potential emergencies, and any supplies they couldn't carry. Most concerning was the timeline. Winter was approaching faster than she'd anticipated, and mountain weather could become deadly without warning. If they encountered significant delays, injury, illness, or impassable conditions, they might find themselves trapped far from any help. A sound in the darkness beyond their camp made her freeze, listening intently. It came again, the unmistakable creak of a wagon wheel, accompanied by the soft murmur of voices. Someone was traveling this same road in the middle of the night, which struck Maggie as odd and potentially concerning. She quietly moved to the barn entrance, peering through the darkness toward the road. A covered wagon was indeed passing by, pulled by 2 horses and driven by figures she couldn't clearly make out in the moonlight. What she could see was that they seemed to be moving with deliberate stealth, traveling without lanterns and keeping their voices low. The wagon passed without stopping, disappearing over the next hill, but its presence left Maggie with an uneasy feeling. Law-abiding travelers didn't usually move at night unless they had compelling reasons to avoid being seen during daylight hours. She made a mental note to ask about unusual activity when they reached the next town, which according to her map should be Millerville, roughly 8 miles ahead. For now she could only hope that their paths wouldn't cross again with whatever business required such secretive travel. As she finally settled down to sleep, using her coat as an extra blanket and Harold's old hunting knife within easy reach, Maggie reflected on the day's lessons. They could do this: cover the distance, manage the logistics, maintain the children's spirits, but it would require constant adaptation. And no small amount of luck. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that an elderly widow and 5 orphaned children could accomplish what others might consider impossible. The journey to Cedar Ridge had begun, and there was no turning back now. The second day dawned crisp and clear, with frost glistening on the grass around their makeshift camp. Maggie woke to find Benjamin curled against her side, seeking warmth in the chilly morning air, while baby Rose fussed softly from her nest of blankets. The older children were still sleeping, exhausted from yesterday's efforts, but Maggie knew they needed an early start to reach Millerville before dark. As she quietly prepared breakfast over the rekindled fire, her thoughts returned to the mysterious wagon from the night before. In daylight, she could see fresh wheel ruts in the muddy road, deep impressions that suggested a heavily loaded vehicle. Whatever those nighttime travelers had been carrying, it was substantial enough to leave clear evidence of their passage. "Grandma Maggie?" Emma's voice was thick with sleep as she emerged from the barn, carrying baby Rose. "She's hungry, and I think she needs changing too." "Thank you, sweetheart." Maggie accepted the baby gratefully, marveling again at Emma's natural instincts with her youngest sibling. At 12, she was shouldering responsibilities that would challenge many adults. By the time the twins and Benjamin were awake and fed, the sun had burned off most of the frost, promising a pleasant day for traveling. Maggie had learned from yesterday's experience, reorganizing their supplies so essential items were more accessible and establishing a smoother routine for breaking camp. "How far today?" Samuel asked, bouncing on his toes with characteristic energy. "About 8 miles to Millerville," Maggie replied, consulting her map. "If we maintain yesterday's pace, we should arrive by late afternoon." "Will there be other children there?" Sarah wondered aloud. Unlike her twin brother, she seemed to think carefully before speaking, processing information in ways that reminded Maggie of her late daughter-in-law Helen. "I hope so. Towns usually have schools, and schools. Need children. The morning's travel proved easier than their first day. The children had found their rhythm. The cart rolled more smoothly on the better-maintained road leading to Millerville, and everyone seemed energized by the prospect of reaching an actual town. Benjamin rode in the cart with Rose, entertaining her with songs and silly faces while the older children took turns, helping Maggie navigate obstacles. Around midday, they encountered their first other travelers, a farmer driving a wagon loaded with pumpkins and winter squash, heading in the opposite direction. Maggie waved politely as they passed, but the man's response was notably cool. He nodded curtly without slowing, his eyes taking in their unusual group with obvious suspicion. "Why didn't he stop to talk?" Benjamin asked. In his limited experience, adults always stopped to chat when they met on country roads. "Some people are just shy," Maggie replied diplomatically, though the farmer's reaction had struck her as more hostile than bashful. An hour later, they encountered a second traveler, a woman on horseback who actually did stop, though her expression was far from welcoming. "You folks having wagon trouble?" the woman asked, her gaze shifting from Maggie to the children with poorly concealed disapproval. "No trouble, thank you," Maggie replied evenly. "We're traveling to Millerville, on foot?" "With all those children?" The woman's tone suggested she found this arrangement scandalous. "Where's your menfolk?" Emma stepped closer to Maggie, instinctively protective. The twins flanked Benjamin, who was still perched in the cart with Rose. Even at their young ages, they could sense the woman's disapproval. "We're managing just fine," Maggie said firmly. "Good day to you." The woman lingered for another moment, clearly wanting to ask more questions, then wheeled her horse around and rode toward town at a brisk pace. Maggie watched her go with growing unease. Word of their arrival would precede them to Millerville, and not in a positive light. "She wasn't very nice," Benjamin observed, with characteristic bluntness. "Some people don't understand that families can look different from their own," Emma replied wisely, earning an approving nod from Maggie. As they crested the final hill before Millerville, the town spread out below them, a collection of perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a main street, with cultivated fields extending toward the horizon. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Maggie could see people moving about their afternoon business. It looked peaceful and prosperous, exactly the sort of place she'd hoped to find for purchasing supplies and spending a safe night indoors. But as they descended toward the town's outskirts, Maggie noticed something troubling. Several groups of people had gathered along the main street, and they all seemed to be looking in their direction. Word of their approach had definitely preceded them. "Stay close together," she instructed the children quietly. "Remember, we're just travelers passing through, looking for supplies and a place to spend the night." The first building they encountered was a combination general store and post office, with a hand-painted sign reading Morrison's Mercantile. A cluster of men stood on the covered porch, their conversation stopping abruptly as Maggie's group approached. "Afternoon," Maggie called out pleasantly, bringing their small procession to a halt. "Could you direct us to somewhere we might purchase supplies and find lodging for the night?" The men exchanged glances before one of them, a heavy-set fellow with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest, stepped forward. "Sheriff Coleman," he introduced himself, though his tone was more interrogative than welcoming. "You the folks Mrs. Henderson saw on the road?" If Mrs. Henderson was the lady on horseback, then yes, we spoke briefly, Maggie replied carefully. "She said you've got no men with you, just an old woman and a bunch of children walking cross-country. That strike anybody else as peculiar?" Several murmurs of agreement came from the gathered crowd, which Maggie noticed was growing as more townspeople emerged from buildings to observe the confrontation. "There's nothing peculiar about a grandmother traveling with her grandchildren," Maggie said, keeping her voice steady despite her rising anxiety. The children had moved closer to her, sensing the hostility in the air. "Depends on the circumstances," Sheriff Coleman replied. "See, we had some unusual activity around here last night. Wagon passed through under cover of darkness, heading west. Today, here comes another group of strangers, also heading west. Makes a man wonder if there's a connection." Maggie's mind raced. The mysterious wagon they'd seen was apparently connected to something that had the sheriff concerned. But what could that have to do with her family? "Sheriff," she said carefully, "I can assure you we have no connection to any nighttime travelers. We're simply heading to Colorado to join family members." "Colorado's a long way from here," another man interjected, "especially for folks traveling on foot. You got papers proving who you are?" Before Maggie could respond, a new voice cut through the crowd. "That's enough harassment for one day, don't you think?" Everyone turned toward the source of the interruption. A tall woman in her 50s, wearing a practical dress and an expression of obvious disapproval for the crowd's behavior. She approached with confident strides, ignoring the sheriff's scowl. "These are clearly travelers in need of assistance, not criminals to be interrogated," the woman continued firmly. "Mrs. Thompson, isn't it? I'm Martha Henley, and I believe you and your grandchildren would be more comfortable discussing your business somewhere private." Maggie blinked in surprise. "How did you know my name?" "I'll explain inside," Martha replied, gesturing toward a neat two-story house across the street. "Children, are you hungry? I've got fresh bread cooling and milk still warm from this morning's milking." The mention of food was enough to win over Benjamin and the twins immediately, though Emma remained cautiously close to Maggie's side. "Sheriff." Coleman looked as though he wanted to object, but several other townspeople were beginning to look embarrassed by the scene they'd created. "This conversation isn't finished," the sheriff warned as Martha began leading Maggie's group away from the crowd. "Yes, it is," Martha replied without looking back. "Unless you have specific charges to bring, Sheriff, I suggest you find something more productive to do with your afternoon." Inside Martha Henley's warm, comfortable kitchen, with the children settled around a large wooden table enjoying bread and milk, Maggie finally had a chance to ask the questions that had been multiplying in her mind. "Mrs. Henley, how did you know who we were?" "Call me Martha, please." The older woman poured coffee for herself and Maggie before settling into a chair. "I received a telegram yesterday from a Dorothy Morrison in Cedar Ridge, Colorado. She asked Emma to watch for her sister and 5 grandchildren who might be passing through Millerville on their way west." Maggie nearly spilled her coffee. "Dorothy sent you a telegram?" "She was concerned about your journey and reached out to several people along the route you'd likely take. I'm an old friend of hers. We corresponded for years before she moved to Colorado." Martha's expression grew serious. "She also mentioned that you might have encountered some legal complications regarding the children's custody." Understanding dawned. Dorothy had anticipated that their disappearance wouldn't go unnoticed, and she'd taken steps to smooth their path. The relief Maggie felt was almost overwhelming. "What about the sheriff?" Emma asked quietly. "He seemed to think we were connected to some kind of trouble." Martha's face darkened. "That's a separate issue, and unfortunately, it may complicate your stay here. There was a robbery 3 counties over last week payroll from a mining company. The thieves escaped with a substantial amount of money, and there have been reports of suspicious activity along the routes leading toward Colorado." "The wagon we saw last night," Maggie murmured. "Exactly. Sheriff Coleman is convinced the robbers are heading for the mountain territories, where law enforcement is less systematic. Your arrival so soon after that wagon passed through has made him suspicious of any westward travelers." Samuel looked up from his bread, his young face serious. "Are we in trouble?" "Not the kind of trouble the sheriff is worried about," Martha assured him. "But it does mean you'll need to be careful about how long you stay in town and who you talk to." Martha explained that while she could provide them with a safe place to spend the night, lingering in Millerville would likely attract more unwelcome attention from both the sheriff and certain elements of the community who seemed to view strangers with automatic suspicion. "There's something else," Martha continued, lowering her voice. "The telegram from your sister mentioned that someone from Kansas might be looking for you. Someone with official authority who might not have your best interests at heart. Mrs. Patterson." Maggie should have anticipated that the social worker wouldn't simply accept their disappearance. If she'd involved law enforcement in other states, their journey could become significantly more complicated. "What do you recommend?" Maggie asked. "Leave early tomorrow morning, before most of the town is awake," Martha advised. "I'll provide you with supplies and directions to the next safe stopping point. There's a family about 15 miles west who might be willing to help, assuming you can reach them without attracting more attention." As evening settled over Millerville, Maggie found herself facing a dilemma she hadn't anticipated. The kindness of strangers like Martha Henley gave her hope that their journey might succeed, but the hostility they'd encountered from others suggested that traveling with 5 children would continue to draw unwanted scrutiny. As the children slept safely in Martha's spare bedrooms, Maggie sat by the kitchen window watching the darkened street. Somewhere out there, the real criminals were continuing their flight toward the mountains, while she and her grandchildren were being treated as suspicious characters for the simple act of traveling together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that their unconventional family deserved the chance to reach safety and start over. But tonight, for the first time since leaving home, they were warm, fed, and protected by someone who understood that sometimes the most important journeys were also the most difficult ones. The clock in Martha Henley's hallway chimed 4 times. As Maggie quietly gathered their belongings in the pre-dawn darkness, Martha had insisted they leave before sunrise to avoid Sheriff Coleman's scrutiny, and she'd provided them with enough supplies to last several days: dried meat, hardtack, canned peaches, and fresh water in new canteens. "I wish you could stay longer," Martha whispered as she helped load the cart by lamplight. "It's been wonderful having children's laughter in this house again." "You've been incredibly kind," Maggie replied, securing the canvas cover over their expanded supplies. "I don't know how to thank you properly." "Get those children safely to Dorothy," Martha said firmly. "That's thanks enough. And remember, if anyone asks, you left yesterday evening heading north toward the state line. That should buy you some time if the sheriff comes asking questions." Emma emerged from the house carrying baby Rose, who was still drowsy and content in her blankets. The twins followed, rubbing sleep from their eyes but moving quietly as they'd been instructed. Benjamin brought up the rear, clutching his stuffed bear and wearing an expression of solemn importance at being part of a secret mission. "The Henderson family I mentioned lives about 15 miles west," Martha explained, pointing down a narrow dirt road that branched off from the main thoroughfare. "Look for a yellow farmhouse with red shutters and a windmill. Tell them Martha Henley sent you, and they'll help however they can." As their small procession disappeared into the morning mist, Maggie felt both grateful for Martha's assistance and anxious about what lay ahead. The road they now traveled was less maintained than the main route, forcing them to navigate around washouts and fallen branches, but it offered the crucial advantage of avoiding the sheriff's likely patrol routes. The first few hours, they made good progress despite the challenging terrain. The children had grown accustomed to their traveling routine, and even baby Rose seemed to enjoy the gentle rocking motion of the cart. But as morning gave way to midday, new obstacles began to emerge: the road, which had been gradually climbing since they left the prairie, now wound through increasingly hilly country dotted with dense stands of timber. What had looked like a gentle incline on Martha's hand-drawn map proved to be a series of steep ascents that left both Maggie and the older children breathing hard as they pushed the loaded cart. "My legs are getting tired," Samuel complained during their second rest stop, slumping against a tree trunk with theatrical exhaustion. "Mine too," Sarah agreed, though she was trying to hide her fatigue better than her twin. Maggie studied the children's faces, noting the genuine weariness beneath Samuel's rheumatics. They'd been walking for 3 days now, covering more ground than any of them were accustomed to, and the novelty of their adventure was beginning to wear thin in the face of physical reality. "Tell you what," she said, making another executive decision. "We'll adjust our system. Benjamin and Rose ride together, but we'll also have room for one more person at a time. You can take turns resting in the cart." The promise of periodic relief immediately improved everyone's morale, and they resumed their journey with renewed energy. It was during Sarah's turn riding in the cart that they encountered their next surprise. A young man on horseback emerged from a grove of pine trees ahead, moving at a leisurely pace that suggested he wasn't in any hurry to go anywhere in particular. He appeared to be about 20, with sandy hair and clothes that marked him as a working cowboy rather than a drifter. "Afternoon," he called out as they approached each other. "Y'all heading somewhere specific, or just enjoying this fine weather?" His tone was friendly enough, but Maggie remained cautious after yesterday's experience in Millerville. "We're traveling to visit family," she replied neutrally. "Long way from anywhere out here," the young man observed, dismounting and leading his horse alongside their group. "Name's Jake Henderson. My family's got a place up ahead, yellow house with red shutters. Can't miss it." Maggie's relief was immediate and obvious. "Martha Henley said we should look for the Henderson family." Jake's entire demeanor brightened. "Aunt Martha sent you? Well, why didn't you say so?" He grinned at the children, who had been watching this exchange with interest. "She told my ma to expect some travelers, but she didn't mention there'd be quite so many of you. Are there really 5 of us?" Benjamin asked seriously, apparently having lost count during the journey. "Let's see," Jake said, making a show of pointing at each child. 1, 2, 3, 5. Yep, that's definitely 5. Plus your grandma makes 6. Ma's gonna need to set extra places for supper." The final miles to the Henderson farm passed quickly with Jake's company. He entertained the children with stories about life on a cattle ranch, answered Samuel's endless questions about horses, and even convinced Benjamin to let him hold baby Rose while they walked, giving Emma a much-needed break. "You folks have been walking from Kansas?" Jake asked when Maggie explained their journey. "That's some undertaking. What's waiting for you in Colorado that's worth all this effort?" "Family," Emma answered before Maggie could respond. "And a place where we can all stay together." Something in her tone must have conveyed the importance of that last point, because Jake nodded with sudden understanding. "Sometimes family's worth any amount of trouble," he agreed. The Henderson farmhouse appeared around a bend in the road exactly as Martha had described. A cheerful yellow structure with bright red shutters, surrounded by well-tended fields and outbuildings. A windmill turned lazily in the afternoon breeze, and several horses grazed in a nearby pasture. It looked prosperous and welcoming, like something from a picture book about ideal farm life. "Ma!" Jake called out as they approached the front porch. "Aunt Martha's travelers are here." A woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was perhaps 45, with graying brown hair and the same friendly demeanor as her son. Behind her came a girl about Emma's age and 2 younger boys who immediately focused their attention on the newcomers with undisguised curiosity. "Mrs. Thompson?" the woman asked, stepping forward with a warm smile. "I'm Helen Henderson. Martha's telegram said to expect you, but she didn't mention what a brave group you'd be, traveling so far on your own." "Please, call me Maggie, and thank you for welcoming us." "We don't want to impose." "Nonsense," Helen interrupted firmly. "Any friend of Martha's is family here. Besides, it's been too long since we've had visitors. Jake, help them get there things inside. Children, are you hungry? I've got stew on the stove and fresh biscuits in the oven." The Henderson hospitality was overwhelming in the best possible way. Within minutes, the travel-weary children were seated around a large kitchen table, chattering excitedly with their hosts while devouring bowls of hearty beef stew. Baby Rose was passed from person to person, receiving the kind of attention that only comes from a household that genuinely loves children. "How long can you stay?" Helen asked as she and Maggie shared coffee while watching the children interact. The Henderson daughter, Mary, was showing Emma her collection of pressed flowers, while the boys had already invited the twins to explore the barn. "We probably shouldn't linger," Maggie replied reluctantly. "There may be people looking for us, and we don't want to bring trouble to your family." "What kind of trouble?" Jake asked, joining their conversation. Maggie hesitated, then decided. These people deserved honesty in return for their kindness. She explained about Mrs. Patterson and the social services threat, about Sheriff Coleman's suspicions in Millerville, and about their urgent need to reach Colorado before winter weather made travel impossible. Helen's expression grew increasingly sympathetic as the story unfolded. "Those children belong with you," she said firmly when Maggie finished. "Anyone with eyes can see how much they love you and how well you're caring for them. The problem is proving that to authorities who've already made up their minds," Maggie replied. "Maybe we can help with that," Jake suggested thoughtfully. "Pow's got connections throughout the territory, business dealings, cattle drives, that sort of thing. He might know someone who could provide official documentation about your character and fitness as a guardian." Before Maggie could respond, the sound of hoofbeats in the yard drew everyone's attention. Through the kitchen window, they could see two riders approaching the house at a pace that suggested urgency rather than a social call. "Pa's back early," Helen observed, rising to greet her husband. "And it looks like he's brought company." James Henderson proved to be a tall, weathered man in his 50s, with the quiet confidence that comes from years of successful ranching. His companion was older, perhaps 60, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Both men dismounted and approached the house with serious expressions. "Helen," James said as he entered the kitchen, nodding politely to Maggie and the children, "we need to talk privately. There's been some developments regarding those robberies, and—" He paused, taking in the scene around the table. "Are these the travelers Martha mentioned?" "This is Maggie Thompson and her grandchildren," Helen confirmed. "Martha sent them our way." The older man stepped forward, removing his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, I'm Marshal William Crawford, Territorial Law Enforcement. I'm afraid I have some questions that might affect your travel plans." Maggie felt her heart sink. Had they been tracked down already? Were these men here to take the children back to Kansas? "What kind of questions?" she asked carefully. "The kind that might help us catch some dangerous criminals," Marshal Crawford replied. "You see, we have reason to believe the men who robbed that mining payroll are traveling the same routes you've been using. We're hoping you might have seen or heard something that could help us track them down." Relief flooded through Maggie. They weren't here to arrest her. They were here for information about the real criminals. "We did see a wagon traveling at night," Emma spoke up before Maggie could respond. 3 nights ago when we were camped in that old barn. It seemed suspicious because they were trying not to be noticed." Marshal Crawford's interest sharpened. Immediately, "Can you describe this wagon? How many men? Which direction were they headed?" As Maggie and the children recounted their brief encounter with the mysterious nighttime travelers, she began to realize that their inadvertent witness to criminal activity might actually work in their favor. Instead of being viewed as suspicious characters themselves, they could be valuable allies in the law's efforts to capture the real wrongdoers. "This information could be very helpful," Marshal Crawford said when they finished their account. "And it suggests you folks might be traveling right behind these criminals. That could put you in danger if they realize they're being followed. What do you recommend?" James Henderson asked. "I'd suggest staying put for a day or two while we coordinate with local law enforcement. Once we've got these robbers in custody, your journey to Colorado should be much safer." As evening settled over the Henderson ranch, Maggie found herself facing an unexpected opportunity. Instead of running from the law, she might be able to help it while simultaneously proving her own family's innocence and good character. The marshal had already expressed admiration for her determination to keep the children together, and his official endorsement could be invaluable if Mrs. Patterson continued pursuing them. But delay also meant risking winter weather in the mountains. And every day they spent stationary was another day closer to impassable conditions. The choice between safety and speed would require careful consideration, and the stakes had never been higher. That evening, as the children played with the Henderson family after supper, Maggie found herself in an intense discussion with Marshall Crawford and James Henderson around the kitchen table. The decision before them was more complex than she'd initially realized, with implications that extended far beyond their own journey. "The way I see it," Marshall Crawford explained, spreading a hand-drawn map across the table, "these robbers are following the old mining routes toward the mountain passes. Based on your timeline and theirs, they're probably no more than a day ahead of you now." "Which means?" Maggie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Which means if you continue west tomorrow, you might walk right into them," James Henderson said grimly. "And desperate men with stolen money don't usually leave witnesses behind." Through the window, Maggie could see Emma teaching the Henderson children a clapping game while the twins helped Jake with evening chores. Benjamin was riding on James's shoulders, giggling as the rancher pretended to be a bucking bronco. For the first time since leaving Kansas, the children looked completely carefree and happy. "How long would you need us to stay?" she asked. 2 days, maybe 3, the marshal replied. "I've got men positioned at the likely escape routes, but these fellows are clever. They've evaded capture for over a week now. Your eyewitness account of their wagon and travel patterns could be the key to predicting their next move." Maggie studied the map, noting the mountain passes marked in red ink. Even without the criminal complication, those routes would be challenging for her group. With winter approaching, any delay increased the risk of being trapped by weather. "Marshal," she said carefully, "I appreciate the law's need to capture these men, but I have 5 children depending on me to get them to safety. Every day we delay brings us closer to winter conditions that could be deadly." "I understand your concern," Crawford replied. "But consider this, if we catch these robbers with your help, I'll provide you with official documentation stating that you've been valuable allies to territorial law enforcement. That kind of endorsement could go a long way toward legitimizing your custody of these children." The offer was tempting. Mrs. Patterson and the Kansas authorities would have difficulty arguing with the territorial marshal's recommendation. But 3 days could mean the difference between reaching Cedar Ridge safely and being caught in mountain storms. Helen Henderson, who had been listening quietly while mending clothes, finally spoke up. "What if there was a way to help the marshal and still maintain your timeline?" All 3 adults turned to her expectantly. "Jake knows these mountains better than anyone," she continued. "He's been guiding hunting parties and supply trains through those passes since he was 16. If the marshal is right about where these criminals are headed, Jake could lead a posse directly to them, using shortcuts that would put you ahead of them instead of behind." Marshal Crawford's eyes lit up with interest. "Your boy would be willing to guide a manhunt?" "Jake's been itching for adventure ever since cattle prices dropped," James replied with a mixture of pride and concern for his son. "Though I'd want experienced lawmen with him, not just local volunteers." "I've got 3 deputy marshals arriving tomorrow," Crawford assured him. "All experienced trackers. With local guidance, we could intercept these robbers before they reach the high passes." The plan that emerged from their discussion was both elegant and risky. Jake would guide Marshal Crawford and his deputies along mountain trails that would put them ahead of the criminals' likely route. Meanwhile, Maggie's group would continue west along the main road. But with a crucial modification, James Henderson would accompany them for the first 50 miles, providing both protection and local knowledge. It's not without danger, the marshal warned. If our timing is off, or if these men change their route, you could still encounter them on the road. Everything about this journey has been dangerous, Maggie replied. At least this way, we're taking active steps to make it safer for everyone. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, having apparently finished her games with the other children. Grandma Maggie, is everything all right? You all look very serious. We're just making plans for tomorrow, sweetheart, Maggie replied. Would you like to help put Rose to bed? But Emma's perceptive gaze moved from face to face around the table, taking in the maps and the tense expressions. This is about those bad men we saw, isn't it? The ones with the wagon? Marshal Crawford looked to Maggie for guidance about how much to reveal. She nodded slightly, trusting Emma's maturity to handle the truth. Yes, the marshal said gently. Those men stole a lot of money from honest working people, and we're trying to catch them before they can hurt anyone else. Are we going to help? Emma asked simply. We already have helped, Maggie replied. By telling the marshal what we saw, we've given him the information he needs to find these men. Emma considered this for a moment. Will it make us safer? We believe so, Marshal Crawford answered honestly. And it will help protect other travelers on these roads. That seemed to satisfy Emma's questions, and she returned to the children's activities. But her brief presence had reminded all the adults of what was truly at stake. Not just the capture of criminals or the completion of a journey, but the safety and future of 5 innocent children who had already endured too much. Loss and uncertainty. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost that hinted at the winter weather approaching from the north. Jake Henderson was up before sunrise, checking his gear and preparing for what could be a dangerous mission. Marshal Crawford's deputies had arrived during the night, 3 weathered men who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of professional lawmen. You sure about this, son? James asked as Jake secured his rifle and packed supplies for several days in the mountains. These criminals have been terrorizing travelers for weeks, Jake replied seriously. If we can stop them, we should. The farewells between Jake and Maggie's children were touching. He'd become a friend and hero to them in just one day, and his departure on a dangerous mission clearly worried them. You be careful, Emma instructed, sounding far older than her 12 years. We need you to come back safely. I'll be careful, Jake promised. And when I get back, I want to hear all about your adventures in Colorado. Benjamin presented Jake with a small wooden horse that his father had carved, his most treasured possession. To keep you safe, he said solemnly. Jake accepted the gift with appropriate reverence, tucking it carefully into his shirt pocket. I'll take very good care of this, he promised as the posse departed into the mountains. Following trails that seemed to disappear into rocky wilderness, Maggie felt a mixture of hope and anxiety. If their plan worked, the criminals would be captured and her family would have clear passage to Colorado. If it failed, they might be walking into greater danger than ever. James Henderson proved to be an ideal traveling companion for the next stage of their journey. His presence lent legitimacy to their group, and his knowledge of local conditions helped them avoid several potential problems. More importantly, his genuine affection for the children and respect for Maggie's determination provided emotional support when the road grew difficult. The terrain was noticeably more challenging now, with steep grades that left everyone breathing. Hard and rocky sections that required careful navigation of their cart. But the scenery was spectacular. Rolling hills gave way to dramatic vistas of distant peaks, and the air carried the crisp scent of pine and snow. Are those the Rocky Mountains? Samuel asked during their midday rest, pointing toward the jagged horizon. Those are the foothills, James replied. The real mountains are still ahead. But you're getting your first taste of what makes this country special. On their second day with James as guide, they encountered evidence that Marshal Crawford's plan was working. A rider approached from the west, one of the deputy marshals, his horse lathered from hard travel. We got them, he announced without preamble. All 3 robbers, plus most of the stolen money. Jake's guidance led us right to their camp. Relief flooded through Maggie so powerfully that she had to sit down on a nearby boulder. The immediate danger was over, and Jake Henderson was safe. What happens now? She asked. Marshal Crawford asked me to give you this, the deputy replied, handing her an official-looking document. It's a letter of commendation for your assistance in capturing dangerous criminals. Should help if anyone questions your character or fitness as a guardian. The letter was everything Marshal Crawford had promised, an official endorsement of Maggie's responsibility and competence, along with a statement that she and the children had been valuable allies of territorial law enforcement. It was exactly the kind of documentation that could silence Mrs. Patterson's objections, but more importantly, it represented vindication of the choice she'd made to keep the children together and seek a new life in Colorado. They weren't refugees or suspects or burdens on society. They were a family helping to make their community safer while pursuing their own legitimate goals. There's one more thing, the deputy added. The marshal wanted you to know that word has come from Kansas. Someone named Mrs. Patterson has been inquiring about your whereabouts, but she's been told that you're under the protection of territorial authorities. That should buy you time to get settled before dealing with any custody challenges. As James Henderson prepared to turn back toward his ranch and family, he pulled Maggie aside for a final conversation. You're doing something remarkable, he said quietly. Not many people would have the courage to attempt what you've undertaken, or the strength to see it through. Those children are lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one, Maggie replied. They've given me purpose and shown me strength I didn't know I had. James smiled. Dorothy Morrison is going to be proud of her sister, and Cedar Ridge is going to be lucky to have all of you. That evening, camped beside a mountain stream with the peaks of Colorado rising before them, Maggie gathered the children around their fire for another story. But instead of tales of fictional pioneers, she told them about real heroes, about Jake Henderson's courage in the mountains, about Marshal Crawford's dedication to justice, and about their own bravery in helping to capture dangerous criminals. Are we heroes too? Benjamin asked seriously. You're the biggest heroes of all, Maggie replied, because you've shown that families can stick together no matter what challenges they face. As the children settled into sleep under a canopy of brilliant mountain stars, Maggie consulted her map one final time. They were perhaps 60 miles from Cedar Ridge now, with the most challenging terrain still ahead. But they'd proven they could overcome obstacles that had seemed impossible just days earlier. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to demonstrate that love and determination could triumph over any hardship. The mountains ahead no longer looked like barriers. They looked like the pathway home. The morning after James Henderson's departure, Maggie woke to find frost covering their blankets and a thin skin of ice on their water bucket. The temperature had dropped significantly during the night, and the wind carried a sharp bite that spoke of winter's approach. As she quietly built up their campfire, she could see her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. It's cold, Grandma Maggie, Benjamin whispered, emerging from his nest of blankets with chattering teeth. That's what happens when we get closer to the mountains, she explained, wrapping him in her own coat. The air gets thinner and colder the higher we climb. Emma appeared next, carrying baby Rose bundled in every spare blanket they possessed. She was shivering, Emma reported, with concern. I don't think she's used to this kind of cold. Maggie examined Rose carefully, noting that while the baby was cold, she didn't show signs of serious distress. Still, the overnight temperature drop was a stark reminder that they were racing against time. Winter in the mountains could arrive suddenly and with deadly force. We need to cover more ground today, she decided, studying the trail ahead. According to her map, they were entering a section of road that would climb steadily for the next 20 miles before reaching a high pass. Beyond that lay the valley where Cedar Ridge was located. The twins emerged from their shared blankets, moving stiffly in the cold air. Samuel's usual morning energy was noticeably subdued, while Sarah hugged herself for warmth as she helped pack their belongings. "How much farther?" Sarah asked, her voice small in the vast mountain landscape surrounding them. "About 3 more days if the weather holds," Maggie replied, though privately she was beginning to wonder if that estimate was optimistic. The road ahead looked increasingly challenging, winding through rocky terrain that would slow their progress significantly. After a quick breakfast of hot coffee for the adults and warm milk for the children, they began what would prove to be their most difficult day of travel yet. The trail climbed steadily from the start, forcing them to stop frequently to catch their breath in the thin mountain air. The cart, which had been manageable on level ground, now required all of Maggie's and Emma's combined strength to push up the steeper grades. "I can help," Samuel volunteered during one particularly challenging ascent, adding his small hands to the cart's handle. "Me too," Sarah joined in, determined not to be outdone by her twin. Even Benjamin contributed by walking alongside and offering encouragement, though his short legs limited how much actual assistance he could provide. Their combined efforts were touching, but Maggie could see that the children were tiring more quickly at this altitude. By midday, they had climbed high enough to see the valley they'd left behind spread out below them like a detailed map. The view was spectacular, rolling hills dotted with farms and small settlements, all looking miniature from their elevated perspective. But ahead, the mountains rose even higher, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds. "Look how far we've come," Emma said with wonder, pointing back toward the distant plains. "We walked all that way, and we're going to walk all the way to those mountains ahead," Benjamin declared, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty as he contemplated the jagged peaks looming before them. During their rest stop, Maggie noticed something troubling. Dark clouds were building over the highest peaks, and the wind was picking up noticeably. The weather that had been merely cold was beginning to look potentially dangerous. "We need to find shelter before evening," she decided, consulting her map for possible options. There were supposed to be several abandoned mining camps along this route, places where they might find buildings solid enough to protect them from a storm. The afternoon's travel became a race against the approaching weather. The clouds continued to build, and the first fat snowflakes began falling just as they crested a particularly steep section of trail. What had started as a few scattered flakes quickly intensified into a steady snowfall that limited visibility and made the rocky path treacherous. "I can't see very far ahead," Emma said, squinting through the swirling snow while trying to guide the cart around obstacles. "Stay close together," Maggie instructed, feeling the first touch of real fear since they'd left Kansas. Getting lost in a mountain blizzard with 5 children would be catastrophic. "Hold hands so no one gets separated." They formed a human chain, Maggie in front following the barely visible trail, Emma behind her managing the cart, then the twins holding each other's hands, and Benjamin bringing up the rear with strict instructions to call out if he couldn't see the person in front of him. The snow was falling heavily now, accumulating on the ground and making each step uncertain. Baby Rose, bundled deep in her blankets inside the cart, seemed unaware of the danger surrounding them, but the older children were clearly frightened by the sudden change in conditions. "Grandma Maggie," Sarah called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Are we going to be okay?" "We're going to be fine," Maggie replied with more confidence than she felt. "We just need to find somewhere to wait out this storm." As if in answer to her prayers, a dark shape emerged from the swirling snow ahead, the outline of a building, substantial enough to offer real shelter. As they drew closer, Maggie could see it was indeed one of the abandoned mining camps marked on her map, a collection of log structures that had once housed miners, Working claims in the surrounding hills. The largest building proved to be a bunkhouse, still intact despite years of abandonment. The door was unlocked, and inside they found a single large room with a stone fireplace and wooden bunks built along the walls. Best of all, someone had left a supply of split firewood stacked near the hearth. "It's like a cabin from a fairy tale," Benjamin said with delight as they explored their refuge. "A very cold fairy tale," Samuel added, his teeth still chattering despite being out of the wind. Maggie quickly set about building a fire while Emma helped the children out of their wet outer clothes. The old chimney drew properly, and soon they had a cheerful blaze that began to warm the space and lift everyone's spirits. "We'll stay here until the storm passes," Maggie decided, looking out the window at the increasingly heavy snowfall. "It's not safe to travel in these conditions." As evening fell, the storm intensified into a full blizzard. Wind howled around the building, and snow piled against the windows. But inside their shelter, the family was warm, dry, and safe. Maggie prepared a hot meal using supplies from their cart, while the children explored the bunkhouse and invented games to pass the time. "Tell us about Cedar Ridge," Emma requested as they gathered around the fire after supper. "What will it be like when we get there?" Maggie shared what she remembered from Dorothy's letters' descriptions of a thriving mountain town with good schools, friendly neighbors, and opportunities for anyone willing to work hard. She painted a picture of a place where they could rebuild their lives and create new memories together. "Will there be other children to play with?" Benjamin asked. "Dorothy mentioned that the town needs more children for the school," Maggie replied. "I think you'll find plenty of friends. What about baby Rose?" Sarah wondered, "Will she remember our old house?" "She'll remember what matters most," Maggie assured her. "She'll remember that she has a family who loves her and takes care of her, no matter where we live." As the children settled into the old bunks for the night, using their own blankets to supplement the warmth from the fire, Maggie kept watch by the window. The storm showed no signs of abating, and she began to worry about how much snow might accumulate before morning. But as she watched the swirling white outside, she also reflected on how far they'd come, not just in miles, but in resilience and determination. These children, who had lost everything just weeks ago, were adapting to challenges that would test much older and more experienced travelers. Emma's maturity and helpfulness, the twins' growing cooperation, Benjamin's courage despite his young age, even baby Rose's contentment in difficult circumstances, all of it spoke to an inner strength that gave Maggie hope for their future. The storm raged through the night, but by morning it had moved on, leaving behind a transformed landscape. When Maggie opened the door, she found nearly 2 feet of fresh snow covering everything in sight. The trail they'd been following was completely obscured, and the cart would be impossible to push through such deep accumulation. "Look how pretty everything is," Sarah said in wonder, staring out at the pristine white world. "It's beautiful," Emma agreed. "But how are we going to travel in all that snow?" Maggie studied their situation carefully. The snow was too deep for their cart, but not necessarily too deep for walking if they were willing to abandon some of their heavier possessions. More concerning was the fact that this early snowfall suggested winter was arriving ahead of schedule. "We're going to have to make some difficult choices," she told the children honestly. "We can only take what we can carry on our backs. Everything else will have to stay here." The process of deciding what to abandon and what to keep was emotionally challenging for everyone. Each item they'd brought from Kansas carried memories and significance. But survival required practical decisions, and Maggie was proud of how the children approached these choices. Emma kept her mother's jewelry box but left behind extra clothes. The twins abandoned their checkers set, but each kept one small memento of their parents. Benjamin, after much internal debate, decided his wooden horse was more important than the extra toys he'd packed. Baby Rose's needs were non-negotiable diapers, Formula, warm clothes, and blankets had to come with them regardless of weight. But Maggie was able to fashion a carrier from blankets and rope that would allow her to carry Rose on her back while leaving her hands free to help the other children. By late morning, they were ready to continue their journey on foot through the snow. Each person carried a pack with essential supplies, and they'd cached their remaining possessions in the bunkhouse in case they could somehow retrieve them later. "Ready for our snow adventure?" Maggie asked, adjusting Rose's carrier one final time. "Ready," came the chorus of young voices. Though she could see apprehension mixed with determination in their faces, the first steps into the deep snow were challenging, but not impossible. By staying in single file and taking turns breaking trail, they were able to make steady progress along what they hoped was still the road to Cedar Ridge. As they climbed higher into the mountains, with each step bringing them closer to their destination, Maggie felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. They had survived their first mountain storm, proven they could adapt to changing conditions, and demonstrated once again that their determination to stay together was stronger than any obstacle nature could place in their path. The peaks ahead were still snow-covered and formidable, but they no longer looked impossible. They looked like the final challenge before reaching the new life that waited for them in the valley beyond. 3 days after the blizzard, Maggie had to admit what she'd been trying to deny for the past 12 hours. They were lost. The snow-covered landscape had obliterated familiar landmarks, and what she'd thought was the main trail had gradually deteriorated into little more than a deer path winding through dense pine forest. "Grandma Maggie," Emma said quietly, adjusting baby Rose's carrier on her back, "this doesn't look like the road anymore." They had been taking turns carrying Rose, and Emma's observation carried the weight of someone who had been studying their surroundings carefully. The trail they'd been following for the past hour was barely wide enough for a single person, and it seemed to be leading them deeper into wilderness rather than toward any kind of settlement. "I think you're right," Maggie admitted, consulting Harold's compass for the dozenth time that morning. According to the instrument, they were heading northwest, which should have been correct for Cedar Ridge, but the terrain around them looked nothing like the descriptions in Dorothy's letters. Samuel and Sarah flanked Benjamin, the three of them, staying close together as they'd been taught. Their faces showed a mixture of exhaustion and growing concern that they were trying to hide from each other. "Are we going to find the town today?" Benjamin asked, his voice smaller than usual. The wooden horse Jake Henderson had carved was clutched tightly in his mittened hand. "We're going to find our way," Maggie replied with more confidence than she felt. "We just need to think carefully about our next steps." She called a halt beside a grove of sheltered pine trees, where they could rest and reassess their situation, without being exposed to the cold wind that had been steadily increasing throughout the morning. As the children huddled together sharing what remained of their food, Maggie spread her map on a fallen log and tried to determine where they might have gone wrong. The problem was that snow had transformed the entire landscape. Valleys looked like hills, streams were frozen and invisible under white blankets, and the very features she'd been using for navigation had become unrecognizable. What's more, the continued cold meant their water was running low, melting snow required fuel for fires, and their supply of matches was dwindling. "Emma," she said quietly, calling her eldest granddaughter aside, "I need you to help me think through our options." Emma approached with the serious expression that had become her trademark during their journey. At 12, she'd proven herself remarkably mature and perceptive, and Maggie had come to rely on her observations and judgment. "We have enough food for maybe 2 more days if we're careful," Emma said without preamble. "Rose needs more formula, and Benjamin's cough has gotten worse since the cold weather started." Maggie had noticed Benjamin's cough too, along with the way Sarah had been favoring her left foot since yesterday. The children were reaching their physical limits, and pushing them further without a clear destination could be dangerous. "What "Do you think we should do?" Maggie asked, genuinely wanting Emma's input. Emma studied the map, then looked around at their surroundings. "The compass says we're going the right direction, but this doesn't feel like a road that leads to a town. Maybe we should backtrack to where we were sure we were on the right path." It was sound reasoning, but backtracking would cost them precious time and energy they could ill afford. On the other hand, continuing forward on an uncertain route could lead them deeper into wilderness with no guarantee of finding civilization. Before Maggie could respond, a new sound reached them through the forest, the distant ring of an axe striking wood. Someone was cutting timber somewhere ahead of them, which meant they weren't as isolated as she'd feared. "Do you hear that?" Samuel asked excitedly, having picked up the sound as well. "Someone's chopping wood," Sarah added, hope evident in her voice. The axe blows were coming from the northwest, roughly the direction they'd been traveling. But they seemed to be some distance away, and the forest could play tricks with sound, making sources seem closer or farther than they actually were. "We'll investigate carefully," Maggie decided. "Stay together, and if anything seems wrong, we'll retreat immediately." They packed their belongings and began moving toward the sound, following what appeared to be a slightly more defined path. Through the trees, the axe blows continued steadily, suggesting someone engaged in serious work rather than casual activity. As they climbed a small ridge, the forest opened into a cleared area where they could see smoke rising from a cabin chimney, perhaps half a mile away. Beyond the cabin, the land dropped into what appeared to be a substantial valley, though distance and snow made details difficult to distinguish. "There's someone there," Emma said with relief. "But we don't know who," Maggie cautioned. "We'll approach carefully and see what kind of reception we get." The cabin proved to be a substantial log structure with well-chinked walls and a solid roof, designed to handle heavy snow loads. Neat stacks of split firewood flanked the entrance, and smoke rose steadily from a stone chimney. Most encouraging of all, they could hear voices, a man and woman talking as they worked. Maggie called out when they were still 50 yards away, not wanting to startle the residents. "Hello, we're travelers looking for directions to Cedar Ridge." The conversation inside the cabin stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of boots on wooden floors. A moment later, the door opened to reveal a bearded man in his 40s, holding an axe, but not in a threatening manner. "Travelers?" he repeated, taking in their small group with obvious surprise. "In this weather? Where did you folks come from?" "Kansas originally," Maggie replied, "but most recently from the mining camp. About 3 days back. We seem to have lost the main road in the snow." The man set down his axe and stepped onto the cabin's covered porch. "3 days back? Lord Almighty, you've been walking through some rough country. Martha," he called over his shoulder. "Come. See this." A woman appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. She was perhaps 35, with the competent look of someone accustomed to frontier life. Her eyes immediately went to baby Rose, then to Benjamin's pale face and the obvious exhaustion of the entire group. "Bring them inside, Thomas," she said firmly. "They're half frozen, and that baby needs warmth." "I'm Thomas Miller," the man introduced himself as he ushered them toward the cabin. "This is my wife, Martha. We run a logging operation in this valley." "Maggie Thompson," she replied gratefully. "These are my grandchildren. We're trying to reach Cedar Ridge to join my sister Dorothy Morrison." Martha Miller's face lit up with recognition. "Dorothy Morrison? Well, for heaven's sake. She's been talking about expecting family for weeks now. The whole town's been wondering when you'd arrive." Relief flooded through Maggie so powerfully that she had to lean against the cabin's doorframe for support. "You know, Dorothy, is Cedar Ridge close?" "About 5 miles down this valley," Thomas replied. "You were actually heading in the right direction. Just took a roundabout route getting here. The main road's about 2 miles north of where you've been walking." Inside the warm cabin, as Martha fussed over the children and Thomas explained their location using his own detailed map of the area, Maggie began to understand how close they'd come to serious trouble. The route they'd been following would eventually have led them deeper into the mountains, away from any settlements, where they could have wandered for days before finding help. "You folks have had quite an adventure," Martha observed as she served hot soup and fresh bread to the hungry travelers. Dorothy's told everyone about her sister walking from Kansas with 5 children. Half the town thought it was just talk. The other half has been taking bets on whether you'd make it before winter. Thomas added with a grin, "Dorothy's going to be so proud when she sees you." Benjamin had perked up considerably with warmth and food, his cough already seeming less severe. The twins were comparing the Miller cabin to their memories of home, while Emma held baby Rose, and marveled at how much more alert and content the baby seemed in the warmth. "Mr. Miller," Maggie said, "would it be possible for you to point us toward the main road? We're eager to complete our journey." Thomas and Martha exchanged a look that suggested they'd been discussing something while the children ate. "Actually," Martha said carefully, "we were thinking it might be better if Thomas rode down to Cedar Ridge and brought Dorothy back here. These little ones need rest, and there's more snow coming tonight. Better to wait it out here where it's warm and safe." The offer was tempting, but Maggie felt they'd imposed enough on strangers' kindness throughout their journey. "We've already taken too much of your hospitality." "Nonsense," Thomas replied. "Dorothy Morrison helped us out when Martha was sick with pneumonia last winter. This is just returning the favor. Besides," he gestured toward the window, where snow was indeed beginning to fall again, "you don't want to be caught on the road in another storm, especially this close to your destination." Emma spoke up before Maggie could respond. "Grandma Maggie, maybe we should stay. Rose is finally warm and comfortable, and Benjamin's cough is better. One more day won't matter if it means arriving safely." The wisdom of this advice was undeniable. They'd come too far and overcome too many obstacles to risk disaster in the final miles of their journey. "If you're certain we're not imposing," Maggie said finally. "It's settled then," Martha declared. "Thomas will ride to Cedar Ridge this afternoon and bring Dorothy back. You'll have a proper reunion, and tomorrow you can all travel to town together." As afternoon faded into evening, with snow falling steadily outside the warm cabin, Maggie watched her grandchildren playing quietly while baby Rose slept peacefully in a proper crib that Martha had retrieved from storage. They'd done it, traveled nearly 200 miles on foot, overcome every obstacle that had been placed in their path, and arrived within miles of their destination. But more than completing a physical journey, they'd proven something important about the strength of family bonds and the power of determination. These children, who had lost everything just weeks ago, had shown courage and resilience that would serve them well in whatever challenges lay ahead. Tomorrow, they would finally reach Cedar Ridge and begin the next chapter of their lives. But tonight, safe and warm in the Miller cabin, with snow falling outside, Maggie allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced since receiving that telegram about Robert and Helen's death. Genuine optimism about the future. The sound of horses approaching the Miller cabin in the early morning light sent all 5 children rushing to the windows. Through the frost-covered glass, they could see Thomas Miller returning with 2 riders, one of whom was a woman in a dark blue coat, who kept urging her horse to move faster despite the treacherous conditions. "That's got to be your sister," Martha Miller said to Maggie, who was standing frozen by the kitchen table, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of their reunion after so many months of letters and now weeks of desperate travel. The cabin door burst open before anyone could reach it, and Dorothy Morrison rushed inside, her eyes frantically scanning the room until they found Maggie. The sisters stood staring at each other for a heartbeat, taking in the changes that time and hardship had wrought, before Dorothy crossed the room in 3 swift strides and wrapped Maggie in a fierce embrace. You impossible, wonderful woman. Dorothy whispered, her voice thick with tears. When Thomas arrived last night saying you'd actually made it, actually walked all the way from Kansas with these children, I could hardly believe it. We're here, Maggie replied simply though. Her own voice was unsteady. We made it. Dorothy pulled back to study her sister's face, noting the lines of exhaustion and worry, but also something new as strength and confidence that hadn't been there during their childhood. Then her attention turned to the children who had been watching this reunion with a mixture of excitement and shyness. And these must be the famous grandchildren I've heard so much about, Dorothy said, crouching down to their level. Let me see. Emma, the responsible one who's been helping take care of everyone? Emma stepped forward with a maturity that still surprised Maggie. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for inviting us to Colorado. Samuel and Sarah, the twins who ask a million questions about everything? Dorothy continued, and both children giggled despite their nervousness. I've been saving up extra questions just for you, Samuel announced seriously. And Benjamin, who's brave enough to walk 200 miles with his stuffed bear. Dorothy's voice grew especially gentle as she addressed the youngest boy. Benjamin nodded solemnly, then held out his wooden horse. Jake Henderson gave me this for protection. It worked really good. Finally, Dorothy turned to baby Rose, who was contentedly babbling in Emma's arms. And this beautiful little lady must be Rose. May I hold her? As Dorothy cradled the baby, Maggie watched her sister's face transform with wonder and love. Rose, who had grown increasingly comfortable with new people during their journey, immediately grasped Dorothy's finger and offered one of her rare but dazzling smiles. She's perfect, Dorothy murmured. They're all perfect. Maggie, what you've accomplished. She trailed off, shaking her head in amazement. The third rider, who had been quietly observing this reunion, finally stepped forward. He was a distinguished man in his 50s, well-dressed despite the mountain setting, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Mrs. Thompson, he said formally, I'm Frank Morrison, Dorothy's husband. It's an honor to meet someone with your courage and determination. The honor is mine, Maggie replied, shaking his offered hand. Dorothy's letters spoke of you so fondly. I hope they didn't exaggerate too much, Frank replied with a twinkle in his eye. But Dorothy has been beside herself with worry since receiving your last letter. Half the town has been watching the roads, hoping to spot you arriving. The whole town? Emma asked with curiosity. Indeed, Frank confirmed. Your journey has become quite famous in Cedar Ridge. Not many people attempt to walk across 2 states. With 5 children, especially with winter approaching. You've become local legends before even arriving. Thomas Miller had been quietly preparing hot coffee and breakfast for the new arrivals. Frank's not exaggerating, he said as he served the adults. Word of your journey spread through these mountains faster than wildfire. There's been quite a debate about whether you'd actually make it. What kind of debate? Maggie asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Dorothy's expression grew slightly uncomfortable. Well, there were some folks who thought the whole idea was impractical. A woman your age, taking on such responsibility, attempting such a journey. They expected you to turn back or, well, not succeed. But there were others, Frank added, quickly, who admired your determination and wanted to help however they could. The school teacher, Mrs. Patterson, different Patterson than your social worker, has been preparing space for the children. The doctor checked his supplies of children's medicines. Several families offered to donate clothes and household items. Samuel raised his hand as if you were already in school. Are there really other children in Cedar Ridge? Dozens, Dorothy assured him. The school has been struggling because families keep moving away to the bigger cities. Your arrival will bring the enrollment up to where they can afford to keep the teacher. What about baby Rose? Sarah asked practically. Is there a doctor for when she gets sick? Dr. Harrison is excellent with children, Frank replied. He's delivered most of the babies in this valley, including several who are now taller than their parents. As they prepared to leave the Miller cabin for the final leg of their journey, Maggie felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. They'd overcome the physical challenges of reaching Cedar Ridge, but now they faced the social challenge of integrating into an established community. Would the reality of their arrival live up to the expectations their story had created? The county ride to Cedar Ridge, their first time in any kind of vehicle since leaving Kansas, revealed a landscape that was both beautiful and promising. The valley spread out before them, with cultivated fields now covered in snow, substantial farmhouses with smoke rising from their chimneys, and clear evidence of a prosperous, well-established community. "The mines are up there," Frank explained, pointing toward the surrounding peaks. "Silver mostly, though there's some gold and copper too. The railroad survey team came through last month, confirming they'll build a spur line to connect us with the main route. That'll bring more business and more families, which means more children for the school," Dorothy added, smiling at her grandnieces and grandnephews. "Your timing couldn't be better." Cedar Ridge itself exceeded Maggie's expectations. It was larger than she'd imagined, with a proper main street lined with substantial buildings, a general store, a bank, a hotel, a church with a tall spire, and various other businesses that spoke of a thriving economy. People moved purposefully along the wooden sidewalks, bundled against the cold, but clearly going about normal business rather than merely surviving in the wilderness. But what struck Maggie most was how many people seemed to be watching for their arrival. As Frank's wagon progressed down Main Street, she noticed faces appearing in windows, and several people stepped out of buildings to wave and call greetings. "Word travels fast in a small town," Dorothy explained with obvious pride. "Especially when the news is as remarkable as yours." They stopped in front of a large, two-story building with a sign reading, "Morrison Boarding House." It was painted a cheerful yellow with green shutters, and its windows glowed warmly with lamplight. A covered porch ran across the front with rocking chairs that suggested summer evenings spent watching the world go by. "This is home," Dorothy announced as Frank helped them down from the wagon. "At least until you decide what you want to do permanently." Before they could even gather their few remaining possessions, people began emerging from nearby buildings. The first to reach them was a middle-aged woman with a teacher's brisk efficiency and a warm smile. "Mrs. Thompson? I'm Helen Patterson, the school teacher. I've been so looking forward to meeting you and these children. We have desks already, and I've prepared some basic assessments to see where everyone fits academically." A tall, bearded man in a medical bag identified himself as Dr. Harrison. "I'd like to examine all the children when you're settled," he said. "Nothing urgent, just to make sure they've weathered their journey well and to establish baseline health records." An elderly woman with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor approached next. "Margaret Walsh," she introduced herself. "I run the ladies' auxiliary. We've put together some household items to help you get established. Nothing fancy, just practical things you'll need." More people continued to arrive, the bank president offering to help with financial arrangements, several women with children in tow eager to introduce potential playmates, the minister inviting them to Sunday services, and various others whose names and faces began to blur together in the overwhelming welcome. "This is quite a reception," Maggie murmured to Dorothy as they watched Benjamin being immediately adopted by a group of boys his age, who were showing him their collection of interesting rocks. "Cedar Ridge takes care of its own," Dorothy replied. "And your family now, which makes these children part of our community. People here understand that everyone's success depends on everyone else's well-being." As they moved into the boarding house, Maggie was struck by its warmth and comfort. The main room was spacious and well-furnished, with a large fireplace surrounded by comfortable chairs. The kitchen was modern and efficient, and upstairs, Dorothy showed them a suite of rooms she'd prepared, 2 bedrooms connected by a sitting area, with cribs and beds already arranged. "We can adjust anything you need," Dorothy said as the children explored their new quarters with growing excitement. "These rooms are yours for as long as you want them. And when you're ready to find your own place, Frank and I will help with that too." That evening, as the children settled into their first real beds in weeks, and baby Rose slept peacefully in a proper crib, Maggie sat with Dorothy and Frank in the boarding house parlor, sharing the full story of their journey. She told them about Martha Henley's kindness, the Henderson family's hospitality, Marshall Crawford's assistance, and the many strangers who had helped them along the way. "You've proven something important," Frank said when she finished. "Not just about your own family's strength, but about the fundamental decency of most people. Your story will inspire others who are facing their own impossible choices." "What happens now?" Maggie asked. "We've reached safety, but we still need to build a life here. The children need stability, education, a future." "Now you rest," Dorothy replied firmly. "You've earned it. The immediate needs are taken care of. The children will start school next week. Dr. Harrison will monitor their health, and the community will help with whatever you need. As for the future, we'll take it one day at a time." Outside, snow continued to fall on the mountain town that had welcomed them with open arms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, for the first time since leaving Kansas, Maggie allowed herself to feel truly safe and hopeful about what lay ahead for her extraordinary family. 6 months after their arrival in Cedar Ridge, Maggie stood in the doorway of the one-room schoolhouse watching her grandchildren participate in the spring recital that had become the town's most anticipated annual event. Emma stood confidently at the front of the room, reading an essay she'd written about courage and perseverance. The twins performed a duet on the piano that Mrs. Patterson had been teaching them. Even Benjamin had a role, reciting a poem about mountain wildflowers with serious concentration. But it was baby Rose's presence in the front row, clapping her chubby hands and babbling encouragement to her siblings, that made Maggie's heart swell with gratitude. The baby who had made their entire journey in a makeshift cart was now a walking, talking toddler who charmed everyone in Cedar Ridge with her bright smile and fearless exploration of her new world. "They've come so far," Dorothy murmured, joining Maggie at the back of the crowded schoolhouse. "All of them, but especially you. The transformation had been remarkable to witness." The frightened, grieving children who had left Kansas 6 months ago had blossomed into confident, happy young people who spoke of Cedar Ridge as home without any trace of sadness for what they'd left behind. They'd made friends, excelled in their studies, and become integral parts of the community fabric. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Harrison approached them during the intermission between performances. "I wanted to update you on Rose's latest examination. She's not only caught up to normal developmental milestones, but actually exceeding them in several areas. That journey of yours, challenging as it was, seems to have strengthened rather than harmed her." Maggie nodded gratefully. Dr. Harrison's regular checkups had been one of many ways the community had embraced their family, providing professional care and personal attention that ensured every need was met. "And Benjamin's respiratory issues?" she asked. "Completely resolved. The mountain air has been excellent for him. I suspect those problems were more related to stress and poor living conditions than any underlying health issues." As the recital resumed, Maggie reflected on the challenges they'd overcome during their first months in Cedar Ridge. Not everything had been smooth. There had been moments of homesickness, difficulties adjusting to new social dynamics, and practical obstacles in establishing their new life. The most significant challenge had come from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, the social worker from Kansas, had indeed tracked them down. She'd arrived in Cedar Ridge just before Christmas, armed with legal documents and threats about removing the children from Maggie's care. But Cedar Ridge had rallied around them in ways that still moved Maggie to tears. Marshal Crawford's letter of commendation had carried significant weight with territorial authorities. More importantly, the entire community had testified to the children's well-being and Maggie's competence as their guardian. Mrs. Helen Patterson, the teacher, had presented detailed academic assessments, showing that all 4 school-age children were performing above grade level. Dr. Harrison had provided comprehensive health records documenting their excellent physical condition. The minister had spoken to their moral character and regular church attendance. Even the bank president had testified to Maggie's responsible financial management. Most powerfully, the children themselves had been allowed to speak. Emma, with remarkable composure for a 12-year-old, had told the visiting officials about their journey, their happiness in Cedar Ridge, and their desire to remain with their grandmother. Her testimony, supported by equally articulate statements from the twins and Benjamin, had effectively ended any question about custody arrangements. "The case is closed," Dorothy had announced after the officials departed. "They've declared you the legal guardian, with full territorial backing. No one can question your custody of these children again." That victory had marked a turning point, allowing them to focus on building their future rather than defending their past. Frank had helped Maggie establish a small seamstress business, taking advantage of her skilled needlework to serve the growing community's needs. The income, while modest, provided independence and dignity that meant everything to her sense of self-worth. Emma had discovered a talent for teaching and was already helping Mrs. Patterson with the younger students. The twins had joined the church choir and become leaders in various school activities. Benjamin had overcome his initial shyness to become one of the most popular children in his age group, known for his storytelling abilities and generous spirit, but perhaps the most significant change had been in Maggie herself. The journey that had begun as a desperate flight from an impossible situation had transformed her from a passive widow, accepting whatever life handed her, into a confident woman who knew she could overcome any challenge. "Grandmother Thompson?" A young voice interrupted her reverie. She turned to see Mary Henderson, Jake's sister, approaching with obvious excitement. "Mary, how wonderful to see you. How is Jake?" Maggie asked, genuinely pleased to see the girl whose family had been so crucial to their journey's success. "He's wonderful. That's actually why I'm here. Jake asked me to give you this." Mary handed her an envelope with her name written in familiar handwriting. Inside, Maggie found a letter from Jake Henderson and a small wooden carving, a covered wagon with a family of figures inside. "Dear Mrs. Thompson and family," the letter began. "I wanted you to know that the story of your journey has spread far beyond Cedar Ridge. People throughout the territory are talking about the grandmother who walked 200 miles to keep her family together. You've inspired other families facing difficult choices, showing them that courage and determination can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. I carved this wagon to commemorate your adventure, but also to remind you that you've become pioneers. In the truest sense, not just by traveling to new territory, but by proving that families created by love are stronger than any other kind." The enclosed newspaper clipping is from the Denver Post. "Your story has reached the territorial capital, and there's talk of using your example to reform custody laws throughout the region. Children shouldn't be separated from loving families just because those families don't fit conventional expectations. Thank you for showing all of us what real courage looks like. Cedar Ridge is lucky to have you. With admiration and friendship, Jake Henderson." The newspaper clipping was indeed impressive, a full article titled "Grandmother's 200-Mile Walk Saves Family, Inspires Territory." It recounted their journey in detail and concluded with editorial commentary about the need for more flexible approaches to child welfare that prioritized family preservation over bureaucratic convenience. "Your famous Grandma Maggie," Benjamin announced, having finished his recitation and rushed over to see what had captured her attention. "We're all famous," Emma corrected gently, reading over Maggie's shoulder. "The article mentions all of us. Does that mean we're important?" Sarah asked with the practical curiosity that characterized her approach to most situations. "It means," Dorothy said, joining their group, "that your grandmother's choice to fight for your family has helped other families facing similar challenges. That's pretty important." As the evening wound down and families began gathering there, children for the walk home through the mild spring air, Maggie found herself surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become as close as family. The Hendersons had made the trip from their ranch specifically for the recital. Martha Henley had arrived from Millerville, bringing news that Sheriff Coleman had been voted out of office for his hostile treatment of travelers. Even Marshal Crawford had attended, now a regular visitor to Cedar Ridge, who always made time to check on their well-being. "You know," Frank Morrison said as they walked back to the boarding house under a canopy of brilliant mountain stars, "when Dorothy first told me about her sister's plan to walk from Kansas with 5 children, I thought it was either the bravest or the most foolish idea I'd ever heard. What do you think now?" Maggie asked with amusement. "Now I think it was both," he replied with a grin. "But mostly brave and necessary. These children needed someone willing to do the impossible for them, and you were exactly the right person for that job." Later that evening, as the children settled into their beds in the comfortable rooms that had become truly home, Maggie performed the nightly ritual that had evolved during their months in Cedar Ridge. She tucked in baby Rose, now sleeping in a proper crib with handmade quilts from the ladies' auxiliary. She listened to Benjamin's prayers, which always included thanks for their safe arrival and requests for blessings on all the people who had helped them along the way. She checked on the twins, who shared a room and often continued whispered conversations. Long after lights out about their plans for the future, Samuel wanted to become a doctor like Dr. Harrison, while Sarah dreamed of teaching school like Mrs. Patterson. Finally, she stopped by Emma's room, where her eldest granddaughter was writing. In the journal Mrs. Patterson had given her. "What are you writing about tonight?" Maggie asked. "Our journey," Emma replied, looking up with the thoughtful expression that had become her trademark. "Mrs. Patterson suggested we should document our story so future generations can understand what we accomplished." "And what do you think we accomplished?" Emma considered the question seriously before answering. "We proved that families don't have to accept defeat when life gets hard. We showed that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have something important to protect. And we demonstrated that most people are good and will help if you give them the chance." Maggie smiled at the wisdom in those words. "Those are excellent lessons, Grandma Maggie." Emma's voice grew softer. "Do you ever regret leaving Kansas? Everything we knew was there. Do you regret it?" Maggie asked gently. Emma shook her head immediately. "No, we have a real home here with people who care about us. We're safe and happy and together. But I sometimes wonder if you miss your old life." Maggie sat on the edge of Emma's bed, considering how to answer honestly. "I miss your grandfather, and I miss your parents," she said finally. "But that old life was already gone the moment we lost them. What we built by coming here isn't a replacement for what we lost. It's something entirely new and different. Something we created together through our own choices and efforts." She gestured toward the window, where the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled in the valley below. "Every light out there represents someone who welcomed us, helped us, or became part of our new family. That's not something we could have found by staying in Kansas and accepting separation." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "So we didn't just find a new place to live. We found a new way to be a family." "Exactly," Maggie agreed. "And that's worth any amount of difficulty we faced getting here." As she prepared for bed in her own comfortable room, the first space that had been truly hers since Harold's death, Maggie reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A devastating telegram had set them on a path that led through kindness and hostility, danger and safety, despair, and hope, ultimately arriving at something better than anything she could have imagined when they started. The 200-mile walk had ended months ago, but the journey it represented, the transformation of loss into opportunity, fear into courage, desperation into hope continued every day. They were no longer refugees fleeing an impossible situation. They were pioneers who had chosen their own destination and built their own future through determination, love, and the fundamental human capacity to begin again. Outside her window, the mountain peak stood silent guard over the valley that had become their home, promising protection and possibility in equal measure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, Maggie Thompson fell asleep knowing that her family was exactly where they belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.